The moment Mike Tyson walked into Giorgio's steakhouse, the atmosphere shifted, not in an obvious way, not with whispers or gasps, but with a subtle ripple of awareness. People noticed. They always did. Not because he demanded attention, he never did, but because his presence filled the room. The weight of his legacy, his history, the sheer force of who he was. Even now, in his late 50s, dressed in a simple button-down and slacks, there was something about him that made people sit up straighter, lower their voices, and take him in with quiet respect. At a corner booth, he sat across from an old friend, cutting into a perfectly seared filet mignon, enjoying his meal in peace. No bodyguards, no cameras, no entourage, just a man who had lived 100 lives in one and was now content in the quiet. Across the restaurant, someone wasn't content. At the bar, a hedge fund manager in a tailored leather jacket and the kind of arrogance that made people roll their eyes swirled his whiskey, watching Tyson with an amused smirk. He was the type who thrived on pushing people, who believed that money and bravado were the only currencies that mattered. And tonight, he had decided Tyson was his next target. "Yo," he muttered to his friend beside him. "You see Tyson over there?" His friend, a fellow finance guy in a fitted blazer, barely glanced up. "Yeah, man. Looks like he's keeping to himself." The hedge fund guy scoffed, tipping back his drink. "People act like he's some kind of god. Dude's old now, washed up, sitting there like a teddy bear. I bet if you pushed him, he wouldn't even do a damn thing." His friend shot him a look. "Yo, don't be stupid. That's Mike Tyson." And he grinned, stretching his arms like he was getting ready for a show. "What? He gonna knock me out in the middle of a restaurant?" "Nah. He's all zen now, right? Thinks he's a monk or some sh*t. I'm telling you, guys like that, they lose their edge. Just another has been trying to enjoy his retirement." The bartender, drying a glass with a crisp white cloth, didn't even look up. He had seen this type before, the guy who always needed to prove something. "Watch this," the hedge fund guy said, setting his glass down. He pushed off the bar and started walking. And just like that, the entire restaurant felt it. The tension, the shift. A waiter slowed his steps, adjusting his tray. A couple at a nearby table paused their conversation. The maitre d', sharp-eyed and quick-witted, subtly straightened near the entrance, already sensing trouble. Everyone knew. Everyone except him. He stopped at Tyson's table, looming slightly, letting his presence linger. "Yo, Tyson." His voice was casual, but loud. Loud enough for people to hear. Tyson, mid-sip of his wine, glanced up. His dark eyes landed on the man like a heavyweight punch landing on an unguarded chin. The air thickened. The smirk on the hedge fund guy's face held. Thin, forced now. "Man, I gotta ask. What's it like being, old?" Silence. A waiter tensed. A man at the bar exhaled sharply, already anticipating what was coming. Tyson didn't react. Not in the way anyone expected. No scoff. No flash of anger. Not even a twitch in his jaw. Instead, he set his glass down, his movements slow. Measured. "I don't know," Tyson said, voice quiet, almost gentle. "I guess it's better than being stupid." A choked laugh escaped from a nearby table. Someone coughed to cover it. A businessman in a suit, pretending to check his phone, fought back a grin. The hedge fund guy's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened slightly, but he forced himself to lean in. He had come too far to back down now. "Man, come on," he said, waving a hand. "You don't miss it? The ring? The fighting? That's all people ever talk about when it comes to you, right? Just Mike Tyson, the old-school knockout king. You don't feel irrelevant." A long breath escaped from Tyson's friend. The room had officially stopped pretending not to listen. And Tyson, he just watched. Not blinking, not reacting, just watching. The hedge fund guy shifted slightly on his feet. He had expected some kind of response, maybe an insult, maybe a fake tough guy routine, maybe even a laugh. But instead, Tyson just sat there, his gaze anchored. And then, Tyson moved. Not much, just enough. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His shoulders rolled slightly as he settled in, the weight of them undeniable even in stillness. The hedge fund guy felt it. That thing, that pressure, not aggression, not hostility, just presence. That unspoken understanding that he was standing too close to something dangerous. Tyson smiled. A slow, small, almost amused smile. "What's your name?" he asked, voice still soft. The hedge fund guy hesitated. For the first time in a long time, maybe ever, He felt something foreign claw its way into his chest. Something dangerously close to fear. The hedge fund guy hesitated, but the moment was too far gone for him to back down now. His name, something he had always spoken with pride in boardrooms, on golf courses, in private lounges where men like him thrived, suddenly felt insignificant in the presence of the man across from him. He swallowed hard, forcing his smirk back into place, unwilling to let the silence stretch any longer than it already had. "Vinny," he finally said, shifting his weight slightly, as if trying to regain his footing, but there was no balance to be found here. "And I know who you are. Everybody does." His voice carried the same forced confidence, but the people around him weren't fooled. The energy in the restaurant had changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy. Tyson nodded once, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "That's nice," he said, his voice still impossibly soft, still too calm for a man being disrespected at his own table. He picked up his knife again, not in any threatening way, just to continue cutting his steak, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a passing thought, an insignificant shift in the evening. His friend across the table watched carefully, not saying a word, understanding that something was happening, something that didn't need to be forced or escalated, but was already playing out exactly as it should. Vinny didn't like being ignored. He had made a career out of controlling rooms, out of making people react, bending them to his rhythm, but Tyson wasn't bending. He wasn't giving him anything. That was worse than an insult, worse than a comeback, worse than being told to leave. He wasn't even worth that much effort. "You know, I grew up watching you," Vinny continued, reaching for something, anything, to regain control of the conversation. "Used to love your fights. Crazy knockouts, man. Fastest hands in the game. But, you know, time catches up with everyone. I mean, look at you now. Just a guy eating steak like the rest of us." He chuckled, trying to make it sound casual, as if the words weren't meant to sting, but the shift in his tone betrayed him. Tyson chewed his food, nodding slightly as he listened, not breaking eye contact. He took his time, swallowed, took a sip of wine, and finally set the glass down. The silence stretched again, just a few seconds too long, long enough that Vinny had no choice but to feel it. "Yeah," Tyson said finally. "Just a guy eating steak." He let the words sit there, unaffected, unimpressed, like a man who had heard every possible angle, every weak attempt at provocation, and had learned long ago that most men only had their words. Vinny exhaled through his nose, gripping the back of the chair across from Tyson as if considering sitting down, but he didn't. He could feel the way people were watching now, the way the staff had subtly adjusted their positions, the way the bartender had stopped polishing glasses, the way even those who weren't looking directly at them were still listening, waiting. "You don't fight anymore, do you?" Vinny asked, pushing forward, his voice losing some of its previous arrogance, replaced by something more uncertain, something that even he didn't recognize in himself. "I mean, sure, you do the exhibitions, but that's not real fighting. No danger. Just a little show for the people who still want to believe you've got it." Tyson nodded again, his expression neutral. "That's right," he said. Vinny blinked. "That's right. Yeah." Tyson tilted his head slightly. "That's what you think. And that's okay." Vinny let out a small laugh, glancing around the room, looking for someone to match his energy, to validate that this was just a joke, that Tyson was just some old fighter who didn't know how to defend himself anymore, that the fear creeping into his gut was misplaced, but nobody returned his look. Nobody wanted to be part of what was happening. He cleared his throat, trying again. "Come on, man. You telling me you don't miss it? That feeling? The rush? All that training, all those years in the ring, just to sit here and pretend none of it matters anymore?" Tyson didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at him, the way a man who has already won looks at someone who still thinks the fight is happening. He shifted slightly, leaning forward again, just a little, just enough. "I never had to pretend," he said, his voice still low but somehow filling the space. "You think fighting is just what happens in the ring. That's where you don't understand." He gestured lightly with his hand, not aggressively, just an acknowledgement of the space around them, the people, the weight in the air. "The fight don't stop when you leave the ring. It don't stop when you stop throwing punches. You know what?" Vinny felt the temperature of the room drop, but he forced himself to hold Tyson's gaze, swallowing hard before answering. "Why?" Tyson's smile was small, almost imperceptible. "Because most people ain't fighting nothing real. The words landed heavier than anything Vinny had been expecting, heavier than any punch he could have imagined taking. He felt his stomach tighten, not because Tyson had said it with anger, but because he hadn't. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a boast. It was just a truth, one that hit harder than anything he had tried to throw. "You got money," Tyson continued, still speaking in that quiet, measured tone. "You got nice clothes, got a nice watch. You got the kind of power people respect in your world. But it ain't real. Not the kind you feel in your bones. Not the kind that stays with you when nobody's watching." He lifted his glass again, taking another sip of wine before setting it down carefully, the sound of it meeting the table somehow louder than anything else in the room. "You don't even know what a real fight looks like." Vinny's fingers flexed against the back of the chair, his face burning, his body telling him to push, to say something, to regain control, but the control was already gone, and he knew it. He had walked into something he didn't understand, and now he was drowning in it. The waiter approached cautiously, sensing the moment, clearing his throat softly. "Would you like anything else, sir?" he asked Tyson, as if to remind the room that things were still normal, that this was still just a restaurant, that this wasn't a fight. Tyson smiled up at him. "Nah, I'm good," he said, his voice warm, easy, as if nothing had happened at all. He turned back to Vinny. "You good?" It wasn't a question. It was something else. A final chance. Vinny felt his jaw tighten. His body wanted to say something, do something, but his instincts, ones he had never needed before now, screamed at him to walk away. And for the first time in his life, he listened. He exhaled through his nose, gave a small, forced nod, and turned back toward the bar. The room stayed heavy as he walked away, the moment lingering even as conversations slowly resumed, as forks scraped against plates, as the sound of normalcy crept back in. But nothing was the same. Not for him. Not anymore. Vinny sat back down at the bar, gripping his glass with more force than necessary, his jaw locked tight as he stared straight ahead. His reflection in the mirror behind the bar was tense, his smirk completely gone, his face flushed in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol. He could feel the bartender's gaze on him, could hear the low hum of conversation slowly picking back up around the room. But the energy had shifted, and he knew everyone had seen what had just happened. It wasn't the kind of moment that people forgot. He had walked over to test a legend, expecting to find nothing more than a washed-up old fighter who had lost his bite. But instead, he had felt something he didn't know how to process, something raw and unshakable, something that made his stomach tighten even now, long after he had stepped away. His friend turned toward him, shaking his head slightly, his voice low but sharp. What the hell was that? Vinny didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his drink, but it didn't taste the same, didn't feel like it had just minutes ago. He set the glass down, exhaling through his nose, forcing himself to sound unaffected. "Nothing. Just talking." His friend scoffed, rubbing his temple as he leaned in. "That wasn't just talking, man. That was you trying to poke a bear and realizing too late that you were the only one in the room who didn't know it wasn't asleep." Vinny rolled his eyes, ignoring the way his chest felt tight, the way his pulse was still a little too quick. "Relax, nothing happened." If anything, he just sat there like a statue. He forced a chuckle, but even to his own ears, it sounded off. Guess he really is retired. The bartender, a man who had worked in places like this long enough to recognize when a man was trying too hard to convince himself of something, gave him a look, but said nothing. He simply wiped down the bar and moved a fresh drink toward him, the silence stretching just long enough for Vinny to feel the weight of his own words. He didn't want to turn around. He told himself he didn't care, that he had already walked away, but some part of him still burned from the way Tyson had looked at him, from the way the entire restaurant had turned against him without a single word being spoken. He had never been in a room where he wasn't the one holding the upper hand. He was the one who was supposed to control conversations, set the tempo, decide how people reacted, but this was different. This was something he hadn't prepared for, and the worst part was that he still didn't understand what had happened. His friend took a sip of his own drink, watching him carefully before speaking again. "I don't get it. Why'd you even go over there? What were you trying to do?" Vinny clenched his jaw, annoyed that the question even needed to be asked. "I wasn't trying to do anything," he snapped, but his own words sounded hollow. He took another sip of whiskey, but it didn't help. People treat him like he's some kind of god, like he's still the same guy he was 20 years ago, but he's not. He's just another guy in a restaurant. No different from the rest of us. His friend didn't react right away. He just stared at him, waiting, letting the silence settle until Vinny finally looked up and met his gaze. You really believe that? Vinny opened his mouth, ready to answer, but nothing came out. The bartender smirked slightly and moved further down the bar. The silence stretched, and Vinny hated it. He hated the way the question lingered, hated that his body wouldn't let him shake off the encounter, hated that no matter how much he tried to act like it hadn't meant anything, his hands still felt unsteady. He exhaled sharply, pushing away from the bar, needing air, needing movement, needing to do something to shake this feeling off. But as he turned, his eyes landed on Tyson's table again, and his stomach dropped. Tyson was still there, still seated exactly as he had been before, still looking as if nothing in the world could bother him. His plate was nearly finished, his glass of wine still sitting there, untouched since Vinny had walked away. But it wasn't Tyson's food that caught his attention. It was the way Tyson was watching him. Not glaring, not staring him down, just looking. Vinny felt his throat tighten. He wanted to break eye contact, wanted to look away, wanted to turn back to the bar and pretend like it didn't matter, but he couldn't. Tyson didn't move, didn't speak, didn't shift his posture at all, but somehow, Vinny felt it all over again. That same presence, that same unshakable weight, the same feeling that had made him step back from the table without even realizing it. He forced himself to hold the gaze, but the longer it stretched, the worse it felt. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't intimidation. It was something worse. It was patience. It was knowing. It was the quiet understanding of a man who had already seen how this would play out, who had seen 100 men like him before, who had nothing to prove because he had already proven everything there was to prove. And in that moment, Vinny understood exactly what had happened back at the table. Tyson had let him walk away. He hadn't backed down, hadn't let it slide, hadn't ignored it. He had just given him a choice. And Vinny had taken it without even realizing. His mouth felt dry. He turned quickly, grabbing his drink and taking another long sip, ignoring the way his friend was watching him, ignoring the way his own hands felt unsteady. You good? His friend asked, his voice quieter now, as if he already knew the answer. Vinny forced a smirk, nodding too quickly. Yeah, man. Fine. Just ready to get out of here. His friend didn't argue. Neither of them looked back at the table. Vinny stepped outside the restaurant, his jacket feeling heavier on his shoulders than when he walked in. The night air was sharp, colder than he expected, or maybe he just wasn't paying attention. He took a slow breath, exhaling hard, trying to shake the tension out of his body. He had come here expecting to enjoy the night, to drink, to eat, to laugh at someone else's expense. But now there was something sitting in his chest that wouldn't leave. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, unlocking the screen just for the sake of doing something with his hands, scrolling through nothing, looking at messages he had no intention of responding to. His friend walked out after him, shoving his hands into his pockets, glancing over but not saying anything right away. The silence between them stretched in a way that was uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that felt like it was pressing down, demanding to be acknowledged. Vinny didn't want to acknowledge anything. He just wanted to move past it, to forget the last half hour, to convince himself that nothing about tonight had gotten to him. He shoved his phone back into his pocket and turned toward his friend, forcing a smirk onto his face. You ready to hit another spot? Maybe somewhere that isn't crawling with washed-up boxers pretending they still matter. His voice came out forced, sharper than he intended, and the moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. His friend looked at him for a long second, then let out a breath through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Man, you're really trying hard to act like that didn't just happen, huh? Vinny scoffed, rolling his shoulders back. What the hell are you talking about? Nothing happened. We ate, we drank, and then we left. That's it. His friend nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was the kind of nod people gave when they saw through something but decided not to push any further. He glanced up the street, then back at Vinny. You sure that's what happened? Vinny felt his jaw clench before he could stop it. Yeah, that's what happened. His friend looked at him again, like he was waiting for something. But when Vinny didn't add anything, he just let out another breath and shook his head. All right, man. If you say so. Vinny turned away, frustrated with the way his friend was looking at him, with the fact that the conversation wasn't over even though he had already decided it was. He pulled his phone out again, flipping through apps, not looking at anything, just needing the distraction. He felt the pressure in his chest again, that same feeling from inside the restaurant, the one that hadn't left since Tyson had looked at him the way he did. He wanted to say something else, to turn the conversation in another direction, to shift the focus onto something else, but before he could speak, he heard footsteps behind him. Something about the way they sounded made his entire body stiffen. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see over his shoulder. Tyson was walking out of the restaurant. Vinny felt his pulse spike before he could control it. He told himself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a coincidence, that Tyson had simply finished his meal and was leaving like anyone else. But there was something in the way he moved that made it clear this wasn't just casual timing. His steps were steady, unhurried, deliberate. Vinny felt something he wasn't used to feeling. His friend shifted beside him, noticing the way Vinny had gone quiet, the way his posture had changed. He followed his gaze, spotting Tyson as he walked toward them, and his entire demeanor tensed. Tyson stopped a few feet away, looking between the two of them, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there, waiting. Vinny's mouth was dry. He forced himself to keep his posture loose, casual, as if this didn't mean anything, as if there was nothing about the situation that unsettled him. He looked at Tyson, trying to hold his gaze the way he had tried in the restaurant, but it didn't feel any easier now than it did then. "You got a minute?" Tyson finally asked, his voice the same as before, calm, steady, giving nothing away. Vinny felt his pulse hammer in his ears. He knew he could say no. He knew he could make some excuse, laugh it off, walk away, and pretend none of this had happened. But he also knew that if he did that, if he turned away now, something would stay with him, something worse than just embarrassment. He swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter than before. His friend looked at him, but didn't say anything. Tyson nodded slightly and started walking. He didn't tell Vinny to follow. He didn't have to. Vinny hesitated for only a second before moving. His steps felt heavier than they should have. He felt the weight of his friend's eyes on him as he followed Tyson down the street. The night felt colder now, or maybe it was just him. Neither of them spoke right away. The sound of the city surrounded them, distant car horns, the low hum of passing conversations, footsteps on pavement, but in the space between them, there was only silence. Vinny kept glancing at Tyson, waiting for him to speak, to say something, to explain why they were here, why he had stopped him, but the longer the silence stretched, the worse it felt. Finally, after what felt like too long, Tyson stopped. They were standing in front of a darkened storefront, the reflection of the streetlights casting long shadows on the glass. Tyson turned toward him, his face still calm, still unreadable. "You know why I asked you to come out here?" Vinny shook his head, even though some part of him thought he might. Tyson looked at him for another long moment, then exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. "Because I've seen a lot of guys like you. Guys who walk into places thinking they own the room. Guys who push just to see who'll push back. And I know how that story goes." Vinny's jaw tightened. "Yeah? And how's that?" Tyson watched him carefully, the way someone watches a man trying too hard to prove something. "It ends with you standing in front of the wrong person one day and realizing too late that you don't have anything real backing you up." Vinny felt heat rise to his face. "I can handle myself." Tyson's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but that ain't the point. The point is, you keep moving like this, one day, you're gonna find out what happens when the other guy don't feel like letting you walk away." Vinny felt his pulse hammering again, but this time it wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper, something he didn't want to name. Tyson let the words settle, let the weight of them land. He didn't say anything else, didn't push further, didn't need to. Then, just as easily as he had stopped him, he stepped back. "You got a choice," Tyson said. "You can take this however you want. Walk away and pretend it don't matter. Or think about what I just said and figure out what kind of man you want to be." Vinny felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to nod. Tyson didn't wait for a response. He just turned and walked away. And for the first time in his life, Vinny had no words. Vinny stood there, watching Tyson walk away, feeling a weight settle in his chest that he didn't know how to shake. The street felt wider, the space between them stretching further with each step Tyson took. Yet somehow, it still felt like he hadn't moved at all. He should have had something to say, something sharp, something dismissive, something that would put him back in control of the moment, but nothing came. His body wasn't responding the way it was supposed to. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one left standing with no power in his hands. His friend was still near the restaurant, leaning against the brick wall, watching with a look Vinny didn't like, the kind of expression that said he had just witnessed something he wasn't supposed to forget. Vinny forced his legs to move, forced himself to walk back like nothing had happened, like this wasn't sitting on him like a weight he couldn't name, but his friend didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, waiting, letting the silence stretch until Vinny couldn't ignore it anymore. That was weird, Vinny muttered, his voice flat, his hands shoved into his pockets as if that could steady something inside him. Dude acting like he's some kind of philosopher now. Thought he was going to give me some deep speech or something, but I guess that was it. His friend didn't look convinced. And what would you have done if he did? Vinny scoffed, rolling his shoulders back, trying to shake off the tension. Same thing I did. Walk away, go home, and not think about it again. His friend exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw like he was considering something before shaking his head. Nah, man, that's not what just happened. You think you got out of there clean, but you didn't. He wasn't trying to fight you, and that's what's messing with you. If he'd thrown a punch, you'd have something to react to. You'd have a reason to be pissed, a reason to say he was out of line. But he didn't give you that, did he? Vinny's jaw tightened. What's your point? My point, his friend said, crossing his arms, is that you just walked into something you didn't understand, and instead of getting what you wanted, you got something else. And now you're stuck with it, because you don't know what to do with it. Vinny let out a short laugh, but there was nothing real behind it. You think this is deep or something? What? You expect me to go home and have some kind of epiphany? That I'm suddenly gonna change because a retired boxer gave me a life lesson? Get real, man. Nothing about tonight matters. His friend watched him carefully, then shrugged. All right, that was it. No argument, no more explanation. Just that single word, letting it hang in the air. And somehow, that was worse than anything else he could have said. Vinny exhaled sharply, shaking his head, pulling his keys out of his pocket. I'm heading out. You coming or not? His friend hesitated for just a second too long before nodding. Yeah, man. Let's go. They walked down the sidewalk, the night air pressing in around them, the city buzzing with its usual rhythm, but for some reason, it didn't feel the same. Vinny wanted to shake it off, to get back to normal, to return to the feeling he had when he first walked into that restaurant. But something had shifted. He could feel it, even if he didn't want to admit it. The car ride was quiet, neither of them speaking, the radio playing something low in the background that neither of them were really listening to. Vinny's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, his thoughts moving faster than he liked. He didn't know why he was still thinking about it, why Tyson's words kept replaying in his head, why he kept seeing the way the man had looked at him. Not angry, not condescending, just watching, like he already knew where this was going before Vinny even had a clue. His friend finally broke the silence as they pulled up to a red light. So what are you gonna do? Vinny frowned, glancing over. About what? You know what? Vinny shook his head, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Nothing. There's nothing to do. It was just some old guy trying to act wise. He don't know me. He don't know my life. He don't know what I've been through. His friend didn't argue, didn't press, just nodded like he was already expecting that answer. The light turned green. Vinny drove, the streets blurring past, the city stretching out in front of him like it always had. But somehow, for the first time, it didn't feel the same.